Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
That Tuesday, Victor got home earlier than usual. It seemed like a pretty ordinary night, the kind where everything unfolds like a predictable movie: dinner with the kids, a shower, some TV, then the couple settling in to talk about their day before bed. But something felt different that night. He could sense it in the air. Vanessa was quiet, more than usual. Her eyes wandered around the room like she was searching for courage in every corner of the walls. As she brushed her hair in front of the mirror, her expression was that of someone carrying a huge weight on their shoulders. And it wasn't one of those tough work days. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that shows up right before a storm. Victor sat in the armchair beside the bed, watching her without saying a word. He'd always thought she was beautiful, even on the simplest days. But there was something in the way she avoided his gaze that made him raise an eyebrow, puzzled. Before he could ask anything, Vanessa slowly turned and said, "I need to tell you something." That sentence dropped into the room like a stone. Her tone was restrained, like she'd been rehearsing it in her head all day. Victor took a deep breath. He didn't expect anything serious, but he knew that whenever someone starts with that line, it's rarely good news. He just nodded, encouraging her to go on. Then she said it. She told him Julian was back in town. For a moment, Victor thought he'd misheard. Julian Foster. That name wasn't just any name. He was her ex-fiancé, the man who, over a decade ago, had almost married Vanessa, the one who'd almost become the father of the daughters sleeping in the room next door. He was a ghost from the past, supposedly buried. And suddenly, he was back, very much alive, right here in the present. Victor kept his composure. He'd always been rational. He wasn't the type to yell or make a scene. So he just asked. That's when Vanessa told him Julian was working at the same company, on the same floor, using the same elevators, occasional lunches together, hallway conversations, laughter in the cafeteria. A string of details she poured out like someone slowly spilling water, trying to soften the impact. But the glass was already overflowing. Victor listened, jaw clenched. Inside, the ground was cracking beneath his feet. Outside, his body revealed nothing. He was just a man who, without realizing it, had been pushed into an emotional minefield. Every new word Vanessa spoke seemed to trigger another explosion. She said she hadn't told him earlier because she knew he'd be uncomfortable. And honestly, she was still trying to figure out her own feelings. Victor cut straight to the point with a direct question. "Have you two met up outside of work?" Vanessa hesitated. It was just a second. But in that second, Victor already knew the answer. When she confirmed yes, they'd had lunch a few times, he simply looked down. Nothing more needed to be said. The truth had settled between them, cold as an ice wall. What Vanessa didn't know, or maybe knew and chose to ignore, was that Victor already had some information. His assistant, Beatrice, loyal and dedicated, had noticed something odd. Vanessa staying late, long lunch breaks, a few conversations Beatrice swore shouldn't have been happening. Beatrice didn't share these observations to judge Vanessa, but out of a sense of protection toward Victor, she saw a good man who deserved a warning. Now, with the confirmation coming from his wife herself, everything clicked. Doubt turned into certainty. Victor tasted something bitter in his mouth. It was the flavor of suspicion, something that had never existed between them before. Vanessa kept talking, trying to explain the unexplainable, justifying with scattered phrases like, "Nothing serious happened" or "It was just an innocent lunch." But the damage was already done. Once trust cracks, it doesn't matter if it was an earthquake or just a small crack. The crack is there, visible. And that's exactly what he saw in her eyes, the reflection of a disturbance, however small, capable of threatening everything they'd built. Victor slowly stood up from the armchair, walked to the bedroom window, and stared at the dark street for a few seconds. Outside, the world seemed calm. Parked cars, streetlights illuminating the sidewalk, a soft breeze rustling the tree leaves. But inside that house, something essential had broken. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't accuse her. Didn't judge. He just turned to her and said calmly, "You should have told me sooner." Then silence. That uncomfortable silence, heavy with everything left unsaid. The room felt heavier. And the next words would be crucial, because in that moment, it wasn't just Julian who had returned. It was also the ghost of something Vanessa thought she'd moved past. And now, out of nowhere, it had surfaced to test the strength of everything she and Victor had built over the last 12 years. And worse, the feeling that this was just the beginning. Vanessa stayed seated on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor like it held some answer. Her shoulders were hunched, and she nervously ran her fingers over the sheet, tugging at small folds in the fabric, as if trying to organize the chaos her words had created. The room, once a place of peace and intimacy, now felt smaller, tighter. Every object in it, the frame with the photo from their last family trip, the book on the nightstand, the pillow Victor used when he slept on his side, suddenly seemed heavier, as if each one was casting its own gaze, a silent judgment. She knew she'd crossed a line. It wasn't the kind of betrayal you see in movies, but something more insidious. It was the betrayal of unresolved feelings, unanswered questions, emotions that should have died long ago but somehow still lived inside her. Hearing Victor's restrained reaction, the way he controlled his tone, the way he chose to look at the dark street instead of meeting her eyes, hurt more than if he'd shouted. His calmness was a reflection of deep disappointment, and she knew it. The silence stretched on for a few minutes. Then Vanessa asked a question that slipped out before she really thought, "Have you never wanted to reconnect with someone from your past?" The question hung between them, floating in the air. But Victor didn't answer, and that lack of response said more than any words could. In that moment, alone with her thoughts, Vanessa dove deep into the tangled mess of her own heart. There was something about Julian she'd never truly buried. They'd loved each other when they were young. A love that didn't make much sense but burned intensely. They'd made plans, picked names for children who were never born, made promises under blankets on rainy days. But it all ended abruptly. Julian accepted a job offer in another state. When she asked him to stay, he hesitated. She took that as a sign of lack of love and decided it wasn't worth continuing. It hurt, but she moved on. Then Victor came into her life. Gentle, steady, reliable. He didn't make extravagant promises. He wasn't as intense as Julian, but he was solid. And at that point in her life, that's exactly what she needed. Over time, she fell in love. It wasn't overwhelming from the start, but it was love. A love built slowly, day by day. Vanessa had never regretted her choice. At least, that's what she believed, until Julian reappeared with the same blue eyes and that crooked smile that used to make her laugh nervously when they were young. During the first lunches with Julian, she kept telling herself it was just curiosity, a reunion between two adults who'd left their story unfinished. She wanted answers, to know what he felt when he left, if he truly loved her, if he'd thought of her, if he'd imagined what their lives would have been like if they'd stayed together. At first, the conversations were light, superficial. Then they grew deeper. Julian asked questions that caught her off guard. He asked if she was happy, if she still wrote poetry like she used to, if she still liked walking barefoot around the house on Sunday mornings. That's when Vanessa got lost, because Victor didn't ask those kinds of questions anymore. Life, routines, kids, bills, accumulated exhaustion had taken the place of those delicate questions. She knew it wasn't Victor's fault. It was just life. But when Julian started speaking with that nostalgic charm, she felt seen in a way she hadn't in a long time, and it deeply confused her. She didn't want to betray. She wasn't in love with Julian. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. But there was a void inside her, a part she'd never had the courage to explore. And now she was facing an emotional mirror Julian was holding up to her, and she didn't like what she saw reflected. She was a married woman, mother of 2 girls, with a nice home, a loyal and hard-working husband, yet she was flirting with an idea. And she knew ideas could be dangerous, sometimes more dangerous than actions. When she realized Victor was still silent, Vanessa carefully stood up and walked to the bathroom. She closed the door, leaned against it, and finally let the tears come. They weren't tears for Julian, or for Victor. They were tears for herself. For the woman who'd gotten lost somewhere between crumpled Monday sheets and the obligations of adult life. For the girl who used to write poems on napkins and now could barely write down her weekly schedule. For the guilt she felt for wanting to be seen again, desired again, remembered as a woman and not just as a mother or wife. She looked at herself in the mirror. She was older, of course. Wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, dark circles that never fully disappeared, a body that didn't respond like it used to. But there was still something there. A spark, a desire to be good, to be worthy, not to destroy everything because of a shadow from the past. She wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and went back to the bedroom. Victor was still standing by the window, not saying a word. She wanted to hug him, to apologize. But part of her also knew it wasn't the right moment. That empty words wouldn't fix anything. Just saying, "I love you," wasn't enough when she'd put that love in doubt. So, without another word, she lay down on the bed, turning her back to him. The distance between them felt like an abyss. And all she could think, staring into the dark room, was whether there was still time to stitch this story back together before it all fell apart. Victor didn't sleep that night. He stayed there for a long time, motionless by the window, arms crossed, eyes lost in the darkness of the backyard. Each thought was like a flood invading his mind uninvited. It wasn't jealousy he felt. It was something deeper, more painful. It was the feeling that the woman he shared his life with, his dreams, his home, raising their daughters, had opened a crack. And through that crack, everything he'd never imagined facing was now slipping in. He sat back down in the armchair. Looked at Vanessa lying there, back turned, silent. She seemed to be sleeping, but he knew she wasn't. The tension in her body, even still, showed she was fighting her own inner battle. Maybe that was the hardest part of all. There was no villain here. There was no clear act of betrayal. But there was distance, a silent rupture, like a crack starting behind a wall and only showing on the surface when it's already too late. During those minutes that felt like hours, Victor thought about everything they'd built together. He remembered the day he knelt on the dock at the small marina, the sun setting behind him, asking Vanessa to marry him. He remembered the shock they felt when they found out about the first pregnancy, and the joy of hearing the baby's heartbeat for the first time. He recalled the sleepless nights holding a newborn, the Sunday mornings with improvised pancake breakfasts, the days when they barely had money but always had each other, and that seemed enough. And now he wasn't sure what they had. Not because Vanessa had done something unforgivable, but because she'd allowed another man to occupy a space meant only for the two of them. And that changed everything. Trust, respect, even his identity as a husband. Victor was naturally calm. But he also had firm principles. And there was a clear line inside him, a boundary that, once crossed, there'd be no going back. He'd always believed love was a daily choice. That loyalty wasn't just about not physically cheating, but about emotionally protecting each other. And in that exact moment, he felt unprotected. When dawn began to color the sky, painting the horizon with shades of orange, he quietly stood up and went down to the kitchen. He boiled water, made coffee, automatically sliced 2 pieces of bread and spread butter on them. Not because he was hungry. It was routine, a way to maintain some control over something while everything else felt out of place. Vanessa appeared a little later, still in her pajamas, eyes red and tired. She walked in slowly, like she was stepping on uncertain ground. Victor placed a mug in front of her without saying a word. She quietly thanked him, but he didn't respond. Then, taking a deep breath, Victor spoke. He didn't shout, didn't point fingers, didn't make a scene, but he spoke with the firmness of someone who knew exactly what he wanted and what he wouldn't accept. He said he wouldn't fight for space against anyone's past. He wasn't the type to beg for attention or loyalty. If she wanted to keep in touch with Julian, if she still felt something for him, then she should have the courage to go all the way, but without dragging him and the girls into that hole. Vanessa tried to speak, but he gently raised his hand, asking her to wait. And he went on. He said he didn't want more assumptions. He needed actions. Then he laid his cards on the table. If she wanted to stay in this marriage, there were conditions. Not because he wanted to control her, but because it was the minimum needed to try to rebuild what she'd put at risk. He said she'd have to cut off all contact with Julian. No messages, emails, lunches, glances, or excuses. Nothing. She'd need to keep her phone's GPS on, not out of irrational paranoia, but for transparency. She'd have to start individual therapy to understand why she felt so vulnerable around someone who belonged to a closed chapter, and in addition, couples therapy so they could both find their way back to each other. Above all, she'd have to distance herself from Iris, the friend who, he said frankly, had been pouring gasoline on the fire while pretending to be a supportive confidant. Vanessa listened in silence, eyes full of tears, fingers gripping the warm mug like it was the only thing keeping her anchored in the present. When he finished, there was no scene, no yelling, no dramatic tears, just a heavy silence, the kind that only happens when someone realizes they're facing a last chance. Victor stood up from the table. He grabbed the girls' backpacks, prepared their snacks, gathered their coats, and laid everything on the couch to take them to school. He didn't do this out of anger. He did it because that's always been who he was. A man of action, a present father, a husband who, even when hurt, still felt responsible. Before leaving, he stopped at the door and simply said, "Think hard about what you want, Vanessa, because you can't keep one foot in the past and one in the present. Eventually, you'll fall into the crack between them." And then he left. There was no anger in his voice. There was pain, but it was a pain handled with dignity, even in its depth. And that made it even harder for Vanessa, because she knew he wasn't bluffing. He was giving her a choice. And the time to decide wasn't infinite. Vanessa stayed alone in that kitchen for a long time. After Victor left with the girls, the mug in front of her was already cold, the coffee forgotten, and the silence around her seemed louder than any scream. She was emotionally drained, like she'd run miles without moving. But in that emptiness now filling the house, she started seeing more clearly the path that had brought her to this point. And inevitably, the name echoing in her mind was Iris. Iris wasn't just any friend. She was the kind of person who walks into a room and makes everything revolve around her. Always elegant, witty, full of bold stories and strong opinions. A woman who prided herself on living without ties, no kids, no husband, no rules. To Iris, freedom was the only religion. And that was exactly what had fascinated Vanessa for so long. Somehow, she saw in Iris everything she wasn't, and maybe everything she'd felt curious or desperate to experience, even if just for a moment. They'd met at work during a meeting about internal campaigns. Iris was new in the creative department, and on her first day, she already had everyone laughing with her sharp humor. But it was at the third meeting, a happy hour after work, that the real connection happened. Iris was fun, but also magnetic. She knew how to listen, but also how to steer conversations into intriguing places that awakened Vanessa's mind. On that particular night, which now came back to her like an uncomfortable movie, Iris made a provocative comment that at the time seemed like a joke. "Have you never wondered what it would be like to be with another man after so many years with the same one?" Vanessa laughed nervously and said no. But Iris didn't let it go. She talked about open relationships, modern couples who love each other but still explore other connections. She said jealousy was just a social construct and that monogamy, sometimes, was a prison. Vanessa tried to argue with points about respect, loyalty, family. But Iris, with a subtle smile, simply said, "Emotional loyalty is more fragile than you think. It only takes a spark for everything to collapse." Back then, Vanessa went home with a strange mix of discomfort and fascination. Of course, she didn't share any of this with Victor. But in the following days, she realized those words had stuck to her like a seed. Small, silent, but alive. And the problem with seeds is that once planted, if they're watered, even unintentionally, they eventually sprout. And Vanessa had watered that seed. Because when Julian reappeared, it was as if Iris's theory had taken human form. She didn't chase after him. Didn't flirt openly. But she allowed herself to feel something. Curiosity, nostalgia, that dangerous feeling of being seen again as a woman, not just as a wife or mother. And before she knew it, she was involved in a quiet emotional game that, while not physical, was slowly eroding everything she and Victor had built over the years. Sitting there, alone, Vanessa finally accepted what she'd refused to see before. Iris wasn't a real friend. She was more like an influence. The kind of presence that shows up when you're vulnerable, and instead of helping you find yourself, pushes you closer to the edge. Worse, she did it with charm, wit, and a false message of freedom that, in reality, was just her way of justifying her own emptiness. She remembered another conversation, just days before, when Iris said marriage was an outdated concept, that no one should spend their whole life with just one person. That men cheat because they can, and women cheat when they're emotionally neglected, and that was more legitimate. You don't deserve to live just as a mother and wife, Vanessa. You're so much more than that, she said, handing her another glass of wine and winking. Vanessa, feeling uncomfortable, smiled, trying to hide her unease. But now, remembering the scene, she felt ashamed for letting those ideas take root, as if they were a valid option for someone just tired of routine, not in serious crisis. Now, though, the crisis was real, and Vanessa knew she couldn't blame Iris for everything. It was her who let the friendship grow, who listened, who accepted that distorted version of freedom. That's why the guilt hurt so much. It wasn't just about what she'd done, but about what she'd allowed. All the small daily betrayals to her own values. Heart racing, Vanessa picked up her phone. She opened WhatsApp and started typing slowly, "Iris, we need to talk." But after staring at the screen for a few seconds, she deleted the message. She took a deep breath, then decided there was nothing to discuss. There was no excuse that could fix the distortion she'd allowed. She opened her contacts, clicked on Iris's name, and chose to block her. The screen flickered. Done. That silent decision, no fireworks, no dramatic announcements, was one of the most important steps Vanessa took that day. It was the first cut, the first step of a woman who, for the first time in a long time, wasn't listening to outside advice but trying to hear what her own heart was saying. And in that moment, she began to realize that if there was still hope for what she had with Victor, it would have to start with her. With the woman who was still there, buried beneath all the confusion. The woman who, even hurt and scared, still wanted to fight. That night, the silence in the bedroom wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the tense silence from the previous night, loaded with anxiety, fear, and disappointment. It was a heavier silence, but different. Like between one breath and the next, there was now a quiet plea to rebuild. Vanessa spent the entire day trying to organize her thoughts, mentally replaying every step, every conversation with Julian, every twisted piece of advice from Iris, and especially, every choice she'd made in the past few days. Memories came in waves, each one bringing a stab of shame and regret. But they also brought a flash of clarity. For the first time in a long time, she was starting to see herself through her own eyes, not through someone else's. She waited hours for Victor to come back. The living room clock seemed louder than ever, as if marking the time of a crucial decision. When she finally heard the key in the lock, her heart raced. He walked in carrying the girls' backpacks, looking tired, his face closed off. He passed by her in the hallway with a small nod and went to the bedroom. He wasn't cold. He was cautious. He knew any hasty word at that moment could be a wrong step. Vanessa took a deep breath and followed him. Not because she had a speech ready or knew exactly what to say, but because she couldn't let silence speak for her anymore. She entered the bedroom quietly. Victor was sitting on the edge of the bed, taking off his shoes. She approached, knelt on the floor, and with tears in her eyes, said, "I'm just here. Not because you told me to be, but because I want to be." He didn't respond. He just looked at her. But it was the kind of look that doesn't judge or accuse. A look that listens. So she went on, without drama, without exaggerated pleas. She said she'd blocked Julian everywhere, that she didn't want more conversations, explanations, or romantic goodbyes. She said he was the past, and she'd made the mistake of looking at him like he was a window. But in reality, he was a mirror, and she saw in him a version of herself she didn't want to be anymore. She talked about her decision to completely cut Iris out of her life, admitting that for a long time she'd sought comfort in advice that only pulled her away from the woman she'd become beside Victor. But the strongest moment of that conversation didn't come from her apologies. It came from the silence she held before admitting, her voice trembling, that she didn't have a clear explanation for what she'd felt. Not because she didn't care, but because she truly didn't understand. And that was the worst kind of mistake. One born in the dark corners of the mind, in the exhaustion of routine, in a lapse of vigilance. A mistake she couldn't blame on anyone but her own weakness. She let herself be vulnerable for the first time, without pride, without defensiveness, but with the humility of someone who knows she messed up badly, deeply, and might never fully fix it. But even so, she wanted to try. She wanted to fight. Not because she feared losing her family, but because she'd painfully rediscovered the value of what she'd almost thrown away. Victor stayed silent for a while, his eyes on her, but also distant, as if he were listening to himself. Inside, he felt devastated. Because hearing Vanessa confess not just the mistake, but the confusion behind it, confirmed his worst fear, she'd almost walked away from him for good. But at the same time, it was as if she was returning in that moment. Hurt, yes. Regretful, yes. But returning. He slowly leaned forward and helped her up from the floor. Asked her to sit beside him. The silence between them, for the first time, felt comforting. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because now there was space for a real conversation. He didn't make promises. Didn't say it was all okay, because it wasn't. The pain was still fresh, and his trust still felt fragile, like glass about to crack. But he looked at her and said something she didn't expect to hear so soon, "I haven't given up yet. But now you're going to have to show me you won't give up either." A wave of relief washed over her. Not because it meant immediate forgiveness, but because it meant there was still a chance. The bridge hadn't collapsed. They were both still standing, even if on opposite sides, looking at each other and willing to rebuild. That night, they slept in the same bed. Not as a passionate couple, not pretending nothing had happened, but as two people who'd survived an emotional disaster. They held each other gently, trying to warm up among the wreckage. She cried softly before falling asleep. And he, without saying a word, just held her hand under the blanket. It was a small gesture, but for someone standing at the edge of an abyss, it felt like a new beginning. A quiet, painful restart, and above all, possible. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.